The morning of October 14th, 1983 began like any other in the town of Red Pine, Oregon. A thin layer of fog draped over the hills and the smell of damp earth rose from the forest floor as the sun slowly warmed the sleepy valley. Elaine Harper woke early, prepared breakfast for her family, and began packing their old Ford Bronco with supplies. Her husband, David, checked the tires and loaded the fishing rods while their children, Anna and Ben, both under 10, fussed over which stuffed animals to bring. The Harpers were known in the community as friendly and low profile, often keeping to themselves but never rude or withdrawn. That Friday, they had told a few neighbors they were heading out for a quiet weekend in the forest just past the third logging road north of Harlan's Ridge. No one thought twice about it. A camping trip in October was nothing out of the ordinary, especially for a family that loved the outdoors. The only unusual thing anyone later recalled was how Elaine hugged her neighbor Clara a little longer than usual and asked if she'd mind feeding their cat just in case they were delayed. By Monday, the Harpers had not returned. At first, there was no panic. The woods were vast. Cell phones were still a decade away, and people often went off the grid for a few days. Clara, however, grew uneasy when she let herself into the Harper house to leave food for the cat and noticed something strange. The kitchen was spotless, too. Spotless, and the beds were all perfectly made. It was as if no one had slept in them the night before the trip, though the car was gone. That same day, David's boss called the sheriff's office after he failed to show up at the mill without notifying anyone. By Tuesday, a search party had been formed. Volunteers, police officers, and even a few off-duty rangers set out to comb the thick forest surrounding Harlan's Ridge. The Bronco was discovered abandoned near an old fire trail, locked windows intact, keys missing. The back seat held a half-eaten bag of trail mix and a crumpled state park brochure. But no sign of the Harpers. In the weeks that followed, the forest was scoured with every resource the town could spare. Bloodhounds were brought in, helicopters hovered low, and boats trawled the nearby lake. Nothing. Not a footprint. Not a discarded boot. Not even a whisper of where the family could have gone. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. Rumors started to spread. Some said they had staged their own disappearance running from something. Others believed they had been victims of a hunting accident, or worse, a targeted crime. But there was no motive. No one had seen or heard anything suspicious. There were no enemies, no outstanding debts, no signs of struggle. Just silence. Eventually, the case went cold. Flyers curled and faded on bulletin boards. The Harper house was sold to a young couple from Eugene who never asked too many questions. For over 3 decades, the story of the missing Harper family became a dark local legend. Teenagers dared each other to camp near the ridge where their truck had been found. Old-timers shook their heads and told newcomers to steer clear of that part of the forest. But time has a way of dulling tragedy. People moved on, and though the town never forgot, life continued. Until the fall of 2019, when a man named Riley Jensen, a real estate photographer from Salem, came to Red Pine to test his new drone. He had heard the forest offered some of the most breathtaking aerial shots in the state. With permission from the Forestry Service, he launched the drone above the fog-draped canopy just past the old fire road near the very area where the Harpers had vanished. As the drone climbed higher, Riley marveled at the sun-drenched treetops, the winding river, and the untouched expanse of wilderness stretching in every direction. Riley almost missed it. It was only when he replayed the footage that evening, scrubbing slowly through each frame, that something caught his eye. A subtle distortion in the tree line. A patch where the foliage seemed slightly unnatural, less wild. He paused, the video zoomed in and saw it. A roof? Not metal, not reflective, but weathered wood almost entirely camouflaged by the dense green. Riley's heart quickened. This was no ranger station or hunting lodge. According to every map he checked, no structure should have existed in that part of the forest. The next morning, he contacted the sheriff's department and forwarded the footage. Within a week, a small team made their way through the underbrush with GPS in hand. What they found stopped them cold. It was a one-room cabin nearly invisible until you were standing right in front of it. The exterior was hand-built, made from local timber and aged by decades of rain and snow. The door hung slightly ajar, the hinges rusted. Inside, dust coated every surface, but it was clear someone had lived there for a long time. There were child-sized shoes by the hearth, a woman's sweater folded neatly on a bench, and a man's journal, with the first entry dated November 1983. There was no power, no running water, only a deep well and a chimney blackened from years of use. On the wall was a family photo, aged and curled at the edges, showing 4 familiar faces smiling in front of a campfire. Word spread quickly. Reporters swarmed the town. Investigators reopened the case. DNA was taken from hair samples found in brushes and clothing. Within weeks, the results were confirmed. This had been the Harpers' hidden shelter. But the question remained. Why had they hidden here, and where had they gone next? The mystery, once a closed chapter in Red Pine's collective memory, had burst wide open, and what followed would rattle the quiet town far more than their disappearance ever had. The initial reaction from local authorities was measured but quietly urgent. Though the structure appeared abandoned, the presence of personal belongings raised the possibility that someone had remained there long after the Harpers were presumed gone. A forensic team was brought in from Portland, tasked with cataloging every item inside and around the cabin. Among the findings were hand-carved utensils, a roughly stitched curtain made from a child's bedsheet, and a small box filled with newspaper clippings from the late 1980s. Most notably, the journal found on the shelf belonged to David Harper. His handwriting was confirmed by a sample collected from the family's former residence. The first few pages spoke of confusion and fear, mentioning that something had happened during the trip that made it unsafe to return to town. But the entries abruptly stopped just 5 months after the initial date, offering no closure, only more questions. Investigators turned their attention to the construction of the cabin. It was evident that whoever built it had done so in a hurry, but with enough skill to make it last. The walls were insulated with dried moss, and the roof had been reinforced with clay and pine bark to ward off rain. Deep behind the cabin, they found an old fire pit ringed with stones half buried beneath years of fallen leaves. Bones, likely from rabbits and squirrels, were scattered nearby, consistent with a subsistence lifestyle. Yet there was no sign of modern camping gear. No flashlights, batteries, or canned food. It was as if the Harpers had chosen to live as if the outside world had ceased to exist. Searchers found a narrow trail leading away from the cabin, but it disappeared quickly into thick brush. Attempts to follow it led to dead ends, and the terrain suggested it had not been used in years. The Harpers' extended family was contacted, and samples were requested to support DNA comparisons. Anna and Ben, now presumably in their 40s, if alive, had no known children of their own, and Elaine's sister was the only close relative remaining. When preliminary matches returned, confirming that multiple strands of hair from the cabin belonged to both children, the reality settled heavily over Red Pine. The Harpers had not simply disappeared. They had stayed hidden in the forest for at least 5 months, maybe longer. What could have kept them there remained unclear. There was no evidence of coercion, no signs of violence, no indication that they were being hunted. Yet, David's journal mentioned something cryptic. He wrote that it was not safe to go back, that trust had been broken and they were being watched. The sheriff assigned a deputy to review all case files from the original investigation. Every tip, witness statement, and photo was examined again under the weight of new evidence. An old report surfaced, largely ignored at the time, from a forest ranger named Max Daly. He had filed a note claiming he saw smoke rising near the third ridge days after the Harpers were reported missing. At the time, the focus of the search had shifted west, and Max's note was buried under a mountain of other leads. Now, his observation seemed chillingly accurate. When contacted, Max was in his 80s and living in assisted care. He remembered the smoke clearly. He had wanted to hike toward it, but his supervisor dismissed the idea. Max claimed that he never forgot about it and always wondered if he had ignored something important. Another disturbing clue emerged from a photograph found tucked inside the journal. It showed the children playing near the cabin, their faces still round with youth, but noticeably thinner than in earlier family pictures. Behind them, standing just on the edge of the frame, was a man. He was older, with a long beard, and wearing a tattered raincoat. His expression was unreadable, his eyes barely visible beneath the hood. David had not labeled the photo, and the identity of the man was unknown. Speculation swirled. Was he a passerby, a threat? Fellow recluse investigators canvassed local shelters and institutions, but found no match. Forensics attempted facial comparison with missing persons databases, but nothing turned up. Meanwhile, the town responded with unease. Locals who had once shared childhood memories with Anna or worked alongside David began revisiting old conversations. One retired mill worker claimed that David had recently been agitated before the trip. He had mentioned someone following him, a stranger, near their property, but no one took him seriously. In hindsight, it all felt too strange to be a coincidence. Even Clara, the neighbor who last spoke to Elaine, recalled that final hug. Elaine had whispered something under her breath, too softly to hear, but her eyes had seemed full of urgency. Clara had chalked it up to stress or travel nerves. Now, she wondered if it had been a quiet plea. Back at the cabin, site cadaver dogs searched the surrounding woods. On the fourth day, they alerted near a shallow depression 50 yards north. The soil had clearly been disturbed long ago. When unearthed investigators found a wooden box carefully sealed inside which lay a small collection of children's books, a pair of gloves, and a tightly wrapped bundle containing a single page of David's journal. It was dated 2 months after the last entry in the book and was written in hurried, shaky handwriting. The words were few but haunting. "We were right to hide. She saw him again. No one else believes me. If you find this, forgive me." The discovery of the buried wooden box changed the entire tone of the investigation. What had initially seemed like a bizarre survivalist decision now carried undertones of paranoia and possible threat. David's final note, short and desperate, suggested not only fear, but a belief that someone was actively pursuing them. Investigators brought in a criminal profiler from Eugene who specialized in long-term missing persons cases. She examined the journal entries, the scattered belongings in the cabin, and the final message buried with the gloves. Her preliminary conclusion was unsettling. David had not intended to vanish. He had not expected to build a new life in the forest. Something forced his hand, and his continued isolation suggested a fear that went beyond ordinary caution. According to the profiler, David was most likely hiding from a person, not a generalized fear of society. She underlined one chilling possibility in her report. There may have been someone living in the woods who held influence over the Harpers, someone they feared enough to cut all contact with the outside world. This possibility prompted a deeper look at the area's history. Red Pine was surrounded by dense forest and crisscrossed with old trails, many of which had not been used in decades. In the early 20th century, the area had been home to a number of isolated homesteads and logging families. Most had moved on, but some land deeds had never been formally transferred. A local librarian named Miss Carpenter assisted in digging through the public archives. In a bound ledger from 1941, she discovered a small parcel of land listed under the name Emerson Weller. The description placed the property only a few miles from where the Harper cabin was later found. Emerson had been listed as a bachelor, no children known to have served in World War I, and returned with signs of what was then called shell shock. According to an old note attached to the file, Emerson had refused to sell or vacate his land despite multiple offers from timber companies. After 1958, there were no more updates. Miss Carpenter speculated that he may have died in the forest without formal notice. This prompted a team to hike toward the area described in the deed. The terrain was brutal, overgrown with blackberry brambles and twisted roots. After 2 days of searching, they found the remnants of what once may have been a homestead. A chimney made of stone still stood blackened by years of rain and moss. Nearby was a collapsed structure almost completely consumed by the forest. Beneath the rubble, they found rusted tools, a bed frame and a series of glass jars filled with yellowed paper. The notes inside were difficult to read but appeared to be diary entries. Some were dated as recently as the early 1980s, long after Emerson was presumed dead. The handwriting was erratic, the content rambling. References were made to trespassers' unwanted eyes and a girl who kept returning to the edge of the trees. One entry read simply, "She wears blue and does not blink. She knows I see her." That night, the team secured the area and brought the journals to the forensic lab. News of these findings reignited public interest in the case. Local news stations covered the story for weeks. Rumors spread quickly in Red Pine, and many remembered seeing or hearing strange things in the forest over the years. One call came into the sheriff's office from a man named Paul Raymond, who had worked as a seasonal fire lookout during the 1980s. He claimed that in 1984, during his final week on assignment, he had seen a woman and 2 children walking near the ridge just before dusk. He assumed they were campers. When he called down to the main ranger station, he was told no permits had been issued for that section of the forest. When he returned to the lookout after trying to follow them, he found a single photo pinned to the inside of his cabin door. It was black and white, a grainy image of a deer in the woods. Paul had kept the photo all these years thinking it was a prank. Now, with the news of the Harpers resurfacing, he believed it was something more. Investigators interviewed Paul in person. He handed over the photo, and forensic analysis confirmed it had been processed with materials consistent with 1980s home darkrooms. On the back, written in shaky cursive, were the words, "They do not belong here." The timing aligned eerily with the period the Harpers were believed to be hiding in the woods. Paul remembered feeling watched during his final nights on duty. He had heard movement near the base of the tower always after sunset, but could never catch a glimpse of anyone. Eventually, he requested to transfer out. He had never told anyone the full extent of his discomfort, fearing ridicule. Hearing that others had vanished during that same time made his story suddenly significant. Further examination of the recovered journals revealed more disturbing content. One entry included a crude map of the area marking several locations with symbols. One such symbol, a rough circle with a slash through it, matched a carving found on the side of a tree near the Harper cabin. Another entry read simply, "They build without asking. Their noise is a warning." It was unclear if the writer referred to the Harpers or someone else entirely, but the recurring themes of intrusion, observation, and territorial anger painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual. Whether Emerson Weller had survived into old age, or if someone else had taken up residence on his land, the evidence pointed to a long-standing hostility toward outsiders. The investigation now revolved around one question. Was the Harper family forced into hiding by a chance encounter with a recluse who lived by his own laws? If so, how long did they survive before something drove them to leave the cabin entirely? And what became of Anna and Ben? If they had lived past 1984, there was no record of them ever surfacing again. Their names never appeared on school rosters, medical records, or social services files. The town began to fear that perhaps the woods still held the answer, and perhaps more than anyone was prepared to face. The recovered journals from the ruins of Emerson Weller's homestead were assigned to a small team of archivists and forensic linguists for transcription. The writing was erratic and frequently dipped into delusional patterns, but among the paranoid ramblings were detailed observations of forest activity. One passage, dated November 1983, described seeing a man building something out of greenwood near the ridge, his movements cautious and deliberate. Days later, another note mentioned a child sitting on a fallen log whispering to herself and sketching into the dirt. These observations aligned eerily with the early days of the Harper family's disappearance. The idea that Emerson or someone adopting his lifestyle had been quietly watching the Harpers became increasingly plausible. The tone of the entries shifted over time from passive observation to anger. The writer claimed that the new arrivals had brought noise smoke and disruption. His forest had rules, he wrote, and they were not following them. Meanwhile, the sheriff's office began receiving letters. Postmarked from within Oregon, but without return addresses, the envelopes contained clippings from old Red Pine newspapers marked with red ink. One clipping featured a photo of the Harpers taken at a school fundraiser shortly before their trip. The image had been circled, and the word "returned" scrawled across the page. Another envelope held a torn map of the region, with a line traced in pencil leading away from the known cabin site toward a deep ravine known locally as Widow's Hollow. The area was steep and difficult to access, largely avoided by hikers due to frequent rock slides and unstable soil. The letters were treated as potential hoaxes, but given the specificity of the contents, law enforcement could not ignore them. A ground search was scheduled with full safety measures in place. The search team moved slowly along the perimeter of Widow's Hollow, marking trees and scanning the underbrush. 3 hours in, a searcher spotted a rusted tin lunchbox wedged between rocks. Inside was a small stack of Polaroids, curled and faded but intact. They depicted 2 children standing in front of a crude wooden lean-to. One of the children, a girl with shoulder-length hair, held up a drawing that showed 3 stick figures inside a square structure and a 4th figure standing outside with arms raised. The photo had no date, but the image brought the search to a halt. One of the rangers who had participated in the original 1983 investigation was called in for identification. He confirmed the girl as Anna Harper. The boy in the picture appeared to be Ben, though the angle obscured much of his face. The implications were clear. The children had survived beyond the initial months. The crude shelter in the image was unlike the well-built cabin, suggesting a second location had been established. Detectives focused next on cross-referencing satellite imagery over the past 20 years. While the dense forest often blocked clear views, one analyst spotted an anomaly in a 2002 image. A rectangular shape barely distinguishable beneath the canopy appeared about half a mile from the ridge where the Polaroids were found. With this new lead, a search unit deployed again, this time with specialized equipment and canine units. The team spent 3 days cutting through dense overgrowth until they reached the site. What they discovered was a half-collapsed shelter surrounded by remnants of what looked like handmade furniture. Scattered across the ground were decayed remains of clothing, a child's drawing etched into a wooden panel, and a rusted tin cup. No human remains were present, but the scene painted a grim picture. It was clear that someone had lived there under duress. The soil bore evidence of attempted cultivation, and several tree trunks nearby had been carved with vertical notches, likely a method of tracking days or seasons. A torn book cover caught the attention of a forensic technician. It was from a volume of fairy tales published in the late 1970s, part of a school library set. Stamped inside the cover was the name of the elementary school the Harper children once attended. This confirmed the objects belonged to Anna and Ben. The site was processed thoroughly, and all items were cataloged for DNA testing, among them a single page from a journal written in a different hand than David Harper's. The handwriting was neater, more rounded, likely a child's. It contained only a few lines, but was devastating in its simplicity. "We have to move again. He found us. Mom is tired all the time. Ben cries at night. I do not know how many days it has been. I miss our house. I miss light. For the team, this was a breakthrough." Anna had been writing. She had left a trace of her voice, however small. Investigators speculated that Elaine Harper may have succumbed to illness or injury, prompting the children to flee or relocate. But again, no graves or human remains were found. If the children had moved on from the second shelter, there was no indication of where they went. The idea that they had been forced to move repeatedly while evading an unseen presence became central to the profile. A man who viewed the woods as his domain, who had tolerated their presence until a line was crossed. While investigators continued combing through evidence, another unexpected development occurred. A retired postman named Hank Bowles came forward with a forgotten memory. In the spring of 1985, while delivering along a rural route outside of Red Pine, he remembered seeing 2 children walking near the tree line. They were dirty barefoot and carried what looked like a metal can. He had assumed they belonged to one of the backwoods families and mentioned it casually at the general store. When the Harpers case resurfaced decades later, he dug through an old box of keepsakes and found a note he had written to himself. It described the encounter and included the location. That address marked with a hand-drawn X became the next focal point. The location provided by Hank Bowles lay at the edge of an unmarked clearing some 4 miles from the last confirmed shelter. The old postman had circled the general area on a weathered map he had kept from his mail route days. The land was now part of a privately owned parcel sold in the late 1990s to a development company that had never built anything on it. Overgrowth had reclaimed the trails, and the narrow gravel road leading into the clearing had become nearly impassable. The search team arrived after a day's hike with GPS trackers and thermal drones. On approach, they discovered faint impressions of what had once been narrow footpaths leading toward the southern end of the clearing. There, beneath the hanging limbs of 2 large cedar trees, they found what remained of a crude structure. It was no more than a lean-to built against a boulder made from branches and weather-worn plastic sheeting. Despite its simplicity, it bore traces of occupancy. A metal spoon rested on a flat stone used as a cooking surface. Underneath a loose panel of bark lay a child's shoe, the fabric bleached by time, but unmistakably from the 1980s. This discovery confirmed the children had made it to the site. Soil samples from the area indicated a small fire pit had been used repeatedly, though the ashes had long since scattered. Around the base of one tree, someone had etched vertical lines arranged in groups of 7. A rough calculation suggested the children may have stayed here for several months. Tucked into a hollow at the base of the tree was a metal tin that once held powdered milk. Inside were small trinkets, a broken wristwatch with a leather band, a marble with a chipped edge, a square of paper torn from a library book, its ink smudged but legible. The page had been folded several times, and on the back someone had written a single sentence in pencil. "If we keep quiet, he does not come." This one line, likely written by Anna, sent a ripple through the investigation team. The forensic team cross-referenced the wristwatch with a missing item report filed by Elaine's sister shortly after the disappearance. She had given David a leather-banded watch for his birthday that year engraved with the initials DH. Though the inscription had faded, ultraviolet imaging confirmed the faint markings. This detail placed the family's presence at the new site months after their initial disappearance. More troubling were the implications of Anna's message. The children had developed a strategy for avoiding someone or something. They were not just surviving, they were hiding. The silence they maintained was intentional, coordinated, instilled perhaps by their mother, or perhaps learned from terrifying experience. Investigators returned to the earlier journal entries from Emerson Weller's homestead. One entry described hearing small footsteps at night and whispers near the trees. Another noted the smell of smoke and the sound of breathing that was not his own. These entries had initially seemed delusional. Now they were chillingly plausible. Detectives followed the surrounding ridgelines and surveyed natural escape routes. The forest terrain limited movement, but a ravine leading northeast opened into a long, narrow meadow that had once been used for grazing. This meadow had a shallow stream and enough visibility to monitor incoming threats. Aerial photos from the early 1990s showed traces of foot trails crossing the field, suggesting movement through the area. A new search was organized. Within 3 days, the team found the remnants of another makeshift shelter on the far edge of the meadow, hidden in a dense thicket of blackberry bushes. Unlike the previous sites, this one showed evidence of disorder. Items were strewn about. A rotted backpack had been torn at the seams. A child's blanket lay half buried under leaves, and nearby a shirt that had once been red was stiff with age and dirt. Among the debris was a strand of hair, light brown in color, caught on the broken buckle of the backpack. DNA tests later confirmed it belonged to Anna Harper. This discovery raised new and painful possibilities. Had the children been attacked here? Had they been forced to flee again? The site suggested a sudden departure, not a planned move like before. Investigators recovered a strip of torn paper that appeared to be part of the same notebook found earlier. The fragment read only one sentence. Ben is not waking up. I do not know what to do. We have no more water. This line was carefully handled and authenticated by handwriting analyst. The emotional weight of the message struck the entire team. It was likely the last recorded words of Anna Harper. The context was devastating. It suggested Ben may have succumbed to illness or dehydration. No remains were ever recovered at the site, but the implication was clear. The terrain beyond the meadow grew increasingly dangerous. The landscape turned rocky and steep with limited cover. If Anna had left the site alone, as now suspected, her trail would have been difficult to follow. A final piece of evidence emerged from a hiker's report filed in 1996. The hiker, a woman named Lacey Meyer, had written a note in a trail registry at the south exit of Red Pine National Park. She described encountering a young woman with matted hair and torn clothing near the forest edge. The woman had not spoken but accepted a bottle of water. Lacey, thinking she had encountered someone disoriented from a nearby shelter, tried to call out, but the girl had run into the woods. Lacey recorded this in the comments section as a strange experience and moved on. The registry had been archived for years and only resurfaced now as investigators sought any trace of Anna beyond the shelters. Following the rediscovery of the 1996 trail registry entry by Lacey Meyer, a renewed search effort focused on the park's southern boundaries. Investigators pieced together the timeline. If Anna Harper had made it to that southern edge, she would have crossed nearly 10 miles of rugged terrain alone. Her clothing was likely deteriorated, her body dehydrated, and her spirit pushed to the limit. Yet she had reached another human being. That one moment between Anna and the hiker might have been the last time she was seen. Lacey, now living in Arizona, was contacted for a full interview. She remembered the girl clearly. Her age was hard to determine due to the dirt and tangle of her hair, but she had looked young, maybe early teens, barefoot with scratches on her arms. Lacey said she had offered the girl water and tried to ask her name, but the girl only looked at her for a few seconds, took the bottle, and ran. Lacey had thought the girl was from a group home or perhaps a runaway. At the time, no alerts had been issued. She had not made a report because there was no context to her concern. Now, nearly 3 decades later, Lacey provided a composite sketch through a forensic artist. The resemblance to childhood photos of Anna was striking. Investigators compared the sketch with an enhanced image generated through age progression software. The match added credibility to the idea that Anna had survived alone after Ben's presumed death. This revelation raised a new question. Where had she gone after that encounter? No shelters in the region had any records matching her appearance. Local hospitals had no admissions that year of a juvenile without identification. It was as if she had vanished again, this time on the cusp of escape. To cover every possibility, the team cross-referenced all child welfare services between 1995 and 1997. No matches. A handful of girls entered foster care during that window, but none with any resemblance to Anna or traceable links to the region. Some were runaways from elsewhere. Others were born under different names. All known identities were verified. The sheriff authorized a quiet public appeal. Without naming Anna, they released a sketch and asked if anyone remembered a girl matching the description seen near Red Pine in the mid-1990s. Most responses were irrelevant or speculative, but one email came from a woman named Leah Fortner in Brookings, a town nearly 5 hours south. Leah was a retired elementary school teacher who had worked in a now-defunct community education program. She remembered a girl who appeared at one of the free literacy nights dressed poorly withdrawn but observant. She gave only a first name, Anna. Leah remembered the girl for one reason. When asked to write her name, she had printed it in capital letters and included a small heart inside the final A. Leah still had an old workbook from that night. She offered to send photos of the page. The writing matched earlier samples from Anna's note found in the forest. This find shifted the search south. Brookings, though far from Red Pine, had a small population and a network of community centers. Records from the education program had been boxed and stored when the building was converted into a town office. Volunteers from the sheriff's office traveled there and were granted access to the archives. They found attendance sheets with only first names listed. But one sheet from August 1996 included the name Anna, no last name, and a note in the margin. No parent info. Quiet. Probably passing through. That same night, the girl had not returned for the second half of the session. A volunteer remembered walking outside to look for her, thinking she had just gone to the restroom. She never came back. The assumption at the time was that she had left with a guardian or relative, but no one had seen her arrive or depart. There were no security cameras in the building back then. A local gas station clerk came forward after the appeal, claiming he had seen a girl matching the photo in the same year around that same time. He remembered her because she had stared at the candy rack for nearly 10 minutes without speaking. When he approached, she walked out quickly and disappeared behind the dumpster. The footage from that period was long gone, and the clerk's memory, though earnest, could not provide much more detail. Still, it confirmed the girl had wandered into town and had likely been trying to avoid detection. She may have been seeking food, water, or even help, but hesitated at the last moment. It was impossible to say what she thought adults would do. Her entire life by then may have been shaped by fear and mistrust. Leah Fortner's workbook was sent to the lab for further analysis. DNA swabs were taken from the pages and compared to the existing samples from the cabin and earlier sites. After weeks of testing, a partial match confirmed that the girl in Brookings was indeed Anna Harper. This provided the most concrete timeline yet. Anna had survived at least 13 years after her family's disappearance. She had made it to town. She had spoken to someone. She had written her name. The heartbreak was in the unknown. She had vanished again, and this time there was nothing left behind. With the confirmation that Anna Harper had surfaced briefly in Brookings in 1996, investigators renewed their efforts to trace her steps beyond that point. The working theory now suggested she may have continued traveling south along the coastal highway, either on foot or by hitching rides. The idea of a teenager surviving alone with minimal social contact for over a decade seemed improbable. Yet all evidence pointed to Anna navigating the world with caution instinct and a deep reluctance to trust authority. Local shelters and service organizations from that period were contacted, including a church-run food program that operated out of a small annex near the southern edge of Brookings. An archived ledger from that program included a handwritten note left by a volunteer named Eric Teller. He had kept a brief log of those who visited for meals. One entry stood out. Girl around 12, said her name was Annie. No shoes. Took food but refused shelter. Did not speak again. Investigators interviewed Eric, now living in Northern California. He had not forgotten the encounter. He remembered the girl's silence, the way she held the sandwich with both hands as if expecting it to be taken back. She had nodded when he asked if she was okay but never spoke. He said she had no backpack, only a thin sweater despite the chill. Eric had walked her to the edge of the lot, trying to persuade her to stay in the shelter. She had paused near a utility shed and glanced at the tree line beyond the parking lot. Then she simply walked away. Eric stood there, helpless, unsure if he had just watched someone vanish for good. He blamed himself for not alerting anyone. At the time, he thought she would return, but she never did. The lot where Eric last saw her backed into a patch of state-owned land dense with scrub and tangled brush. A trail once used by vagrants and transients wound behind the church annex and disappeared near an abandoned freight line. That railway had been shut down after a coastal flood in the late 1980s, but remained partially intact, its rusted tracks winding through the hills. Search crews hiked the stretch in both directions, looking for makeshift shelters or overlooked clues. About 2 miles in, they found a small camp hidden between a collapsed boxcar and a thicket of brambles. The camp had clearly been used, but not in many years. A cracked enamel cup, a wool blanket, and a pair of hand-stitched moccasins were discovered beneath the edge of the boxcar. The items were tagged and sent for analysis. DNA results later confirmed that skin cells from the blanket matched Anna's profile. Forensic experts estimated the camp had last been used in the late 1990s. The presence of Anna's DNA suggested she had survived at least 3 more years beyond Brookings. How she had evaded all official contact remained unclear. She had never enrolled in school under any alias, never been admitted to a hospital, and no missing persons reports described a girl of her appearance. Investigators considered whether someone had taken her in unofficially someone who never reported her presence to the authorities. This theory prompted a door-to-door canvass along the small towns near the coast south of the rail line. Volunteers knocked on more than 100 doors, asking about any memories of a young girl who might have passed through during those years. In a coastal trailer park near Pistol River, a woman named Alma Drury hesitated before inviting the detectives inside. She was in her 60s, living alone, and her hands trembled as she poured coffee for the officers. Alma said that in 1999 a girl had appeared outside her trailer one morning, sitting under the eaves and shivering from the cold. The girl had not knocked, not asked for help. She simply sat there until Alma opened the door. When Alma spoke, the girl did not respond right away. Eventually, she said her name was Annie. Alma had offered her soup and let her stay one night. The girl barely spoke, only nodded. The next morning, she was gone. Alma had not told anyone. She assumed the girl was part of a nearby camp, but now, hearing the story on the news, she believed it might have been Anna Harper. Alma's memory proved vital. She had kept an old ragged sweater the girl left behind. It had been draped over a chair and forgotten in a storage closet. The sweater was collected and tested. The results confirmed it once belonged to Anna. Alma's account became another crucial piece of the puzzle. Anna had survived 16 years after her disappearance, moving carefully, living in silence, and avoiding permanent ties. The timeline now stretched farther than anyone had dared to imagine. Each new discovery painted a picture of resilience but also deep fear. The young girl who had vanished in the woods had grown up moving through shadows, never staying long, never fully trusting anyone. With the confirmation that Anna Harper had been alive at least until 1999, the investigative team turned its focus to the people she might have encountered during those years. The pattern was becoming clearer. She surfaced only briefly and disappeared just as quickly, never remaining in one place long enough to form lasting connections. Despite this, each interaction left behind a trace, a memory, or a possession. Analysts began mapping the trail of sightings and DNA-confirmed items, noting a consistent direction in her movement. It followed the coast, weaving southward through Oregon into northern California. Among the dozens of inquiries, one name kept appearing in local witness reports from Crescent City in the early 2000s. People recalled a quiet older man who occasionally brought supplies into a nearby encampment off the bluff. He had been referred to only as Vernon, and according to those who spoke about him, he was known for keeping to himself and helping transients without asking questions. Vernon Townsend had passed away in 2011, but his nephew Michael had inherited the property. When approached by investigators, Michael mentioned that Vernon kept detailed notes in old ledgers and spiral notebooks. He had no idea they might contain anything of interest, but he agreed to allow the team to search the collection. Most of the entries were mundane lists of items, short thoughts, and sketches of birds. But inside one weathered notebook dated 2000 to 2002, they found something unexpected. On several pages, Vernon had written about a girl. She never told me her real name, said it was Annie, showed up near the trail in April. Clothes all wrong for the season. Took food but barely spoke. Always watched the tree line before eating. Another page read, "She sleeps outside even when I offer shelter. Never complains. Has a drawing in her pocket of a cabin. Looks like something she remembers." These notes were unlike anything else in Vernon's journals. The tone was reverent, cautious, and sometimes protective. He never pressed her for answers, but noted small details. She always walked barefoot at dusk. She carried a stone wrapped in cloth. She once hummed a tune that made Vernon cry, though he did not know why. Investigators cross-referenced the dates and locations. It aligned perfectly with the confirmed timeline of Anna's movements. Vernon's last entry about her read, "She left in the night. I heard nothing, just found the stone on my step. Thought it might mean goodbye. Vernon had drawn the stone. It matched one previously found at the Harper cabin, smooth oblong with a faint crack across the surface. A geologist later confirmed the stone likely originated near Pine Hollow, the site where the Harper family had first vanished. For the first time, it appeared Anna had formed a brief connection, perhaps one of the few, in her adult life. Vernon never alerted authorities, never recorded her face, but his words offered a glimpse into who Anna had become. Quiet, guarded, but still carrying the weight of her past. A forensic linguist studied Vernon's journals and concluded that he saw her as someone damaged but not broken. His notes suggested she was more than a survivor. She retained elements of her childhood, drawing cabins, humming songs, clinging to a single stone from home. This emotional continuity over 2 decades painted a poignant portrait. Anna had not forgotten. She had not let go of her origin, even as she drifted farther from it. After Crescent City, the trail grew cold again. No confirmed sightings followed. Investigators turned to local police reports from the early 2000s, focusing on welfare checks, loitering calls, or encounters with unidentified women. In Humboldt County, a 2003 report described a young woman found sleeping in a greenhouse outside Arcata. She had no identification and refused transport to a shelter. The responding officer noted she had a drawing in her possession and a piece of blue fabric sewn into her coat. She left the station before paperwork was filed. No name was recorded. That drawing was not preserved, but the description matched the paper found near Anna's earlier camp. The detail of the blue fabric caught the attention of the forensics team. Elaine Harper had been wearing a light blue shawl in the last photo taken of the family before their disappearance. It was possible the fabric had been saved, repurposed, and worn by Anna years later. While no physical evidence remained from the Arcata encounter, it gave the team another vector of direction. She was still heading south. Investigators reviewed a missing persons file from Mendocino County dated 2004. A property owner had reported a woman trespassing on his land near the Big River Trail. He never confronted her, but saw her on 2 occasions, once gathering mushrooms and another time washing her face in the river. The report was vague, and the woman was never found again. No name, no belongings recovered. However, it aligned with Anna's pattern. She traveled lightly, moved in silence, and avoided direct contact. In 2005, the sighting stopped. No one had seen her. No belongings had surfaced, and no campsites matched her known methods of living. Investigators feared the worst, but hoped she had finally reached safety or a life she could live without fear. By early 2020, the Harper investigation had become one of the most persistent, unsolved disappearances in Oregon history. With Anna's trail cold for over a decade, the task force began closing the case files into a long-term archive. But before everything was sealed, one junior analyst, Mira Langley, decided to make a final attempt to find any link beyond Mendocino. She combed through public estate records, focusing on properties inherited in rural regions between 2005 and 2015. Mira reasoned that if Anna had found shelter, it was more likely to have been through unregistered means or in places where the owners had little oversight. Her search led her to a derelict farmhouse near Willits, California, owned by a man named Claude Garrison, who died in 2013. His records were never fully processed due to lack of family or next of kin. The house had been untouched for years, and the land, overgrown and fenced, had recently been listed for tax auction. Mira contacted the current county office and received permission to review the interior before its demolition. The farmhouse stood on cracked foundations, the porch warped by years of neglect. Inside, dust blanketed every surface, and vines pushed through shattered windows. Mira walked through each room carefully. Most of the furniture was broken or missing, but in the pantry she found a locked tin box tucked beneath a shelf. With help from local police, the box was opened on site. Inside was a cloth bundle containing small items: a pressed flower, a ring made of braided thread, a postcard from Brookings with no writing, and a ledger. The notebook contained careful handwriting and appeared to document daily routines. The first pages described farm chores and notes about chickens and repairs. But 20 pages in the tone shifted. A new voice emerged. She asked if she could sleep in the barn. Said nothing else. Stayed up all night with the light on. Next morning, she was gone. Came back a week later. Never asked for food, just water. The entries became more frequent. She cleaned without being told. Slept near the door. Never looked me in the eye. Carried a cloth bag that she never let go of. Never spoke unless spoken to. Slowly, the man began referring to her as Anne. She helped me patch the fence today, watched the birds for an hour. Still no shoes. In another entry he wrote, she hummed a song again. Same tune every time. I asked her where she learned it. She said she forgot. These notes dated from 2006 through late 2008. The writer, presumed to be Claude, never mentioned alerting anyone. He described her leaving for days at a time, always returning with pine needles in her hair or sap on her hands. Once he wrote, she came back bleeding. Would not say why. Let me clean the cut. First time she let me near. Handwriting experts matched the style of these ledger entries with documents known to have been written by Claude Garrison. His tone changed subtly across the years. In 2007, he wrote, she called me Claude for the first time. Said it softly, like she was trying it out. No one had called me anything in years. His final entry regarding Anna was dated May 2009. She left before sunrise. Left the bag, too, thought she would be back. She never came. Inside the same tin box was a canvas pouch with items believed to belong to Anna. A folded drawing of a house with smoke rising from its chimney. A set of carvings shaped like birds. A stone nearly smooth with a faint crack across the middle. The stone matched the one Vernon Townsend had drawn in his journal. Forensic testing confirmed that hair from the pouch matched Anna Harper's DNA. A partial fingerprint on the ledger also aligned with previous prints found on her workbook in Brookings. These were not just memories. They were physical confirmations that she had stayed there. Investigators theorized that Claude had respected Anna's autonomy, offering her shelter without pressing questions. Perhaps she had trusted him more than anyone before. Her prolonged presence on the farm marked her longest stay in any known location. Yet, just like before, she left without explanation, and again, no one heard from her. The house was searched thoroughly. No remains were found, no new evidence of injury or death. It was assumed that Anna had moved on, as she had always done. But something about this site felt different. The items she left behind were more personal than ever. The pouch, the stone, and especially the drawing. The team believed this site might have been the closest thing to home she had known in adulthood. Mira Langley, moved by what she found, arranged for the items to be preserved in a protected archive. The case was not officially closed, but after this, there was little left to pursue. Anna Harper had become more than a missing person. She had become a quiet myth living at the edges of memory and wilderness. In the spring of 2022, more than 3 decades after the Harper family disappeared, the file was quietly handed to a new archivist in Portland named Grace Elwood. Grace was not part of law enforcement. She worked for the Oregon Historical Record Society, specializing in cold case documentation and oral histories. She had no authority to reopen investigations or submit forensic requests, but she had a deep interest in unresolved stories that shaped rural memory. The Harper file, bloated with maps, photos, DNA reports, and notebooks, had become more than a criminal case. It had become a kind of regional folklore. People still whispered about the cabin, the girl who ran barefoot for years, the notes she left behind like breadcrumbs. Grace requested permission to interview surviving witnesses and community members who had intersected with Anna's path. She did not expect to find Anna. She only hoped to better understand how someone could survive that long unseen and what kind of world allowed her to vanish again and again. Grace's first interviews took her back through familiar terrain. She spoke to Leah Fortner, who still kept the workbook from Brookings. Leah cried when she saw a recent age-progressed photo of Anna. It was not a perfect likeness, but it reminded her of something quiet and wounded. Grace recorded every story and cataloged each one with patience. In Crescent City, she met Michael Townsend, who gave her access to his Uncle Vernon's journals. Grace read each line with care, noting how Vernon had never pitied Anna. He had seen her as someone outside of ordinary time. Not a girl in need of rescue, but a person choosing to live on her own terms, even if those terms were forged in trauma. In Willits, Grace walked the perimeter of the old Garrison farm just before demolition. She stood where the tin box had been found. The house had been stripped bare. No sign remained of Anna, only the drawings and the stone now kept in the archive. The interviews stretched through the summer. In the fall, Grace received an anonymous letter. It arrived in a plain envelope with no return address postmarked in Santa Rosa. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was careful, slightly shaky, not unfamiliar. It read simply, "There is a place called Stillwater. No one looks for anyone there, that was all." Grace had never seen the name in any file. Stillwater was not a listed town. It did not appear in state records or on any map she checked. She contacted local historians, land survey offices, and postal directories. Finally, an elderly librarian in Sonoma County recalled the name. Stillwater had once been a small off-grid community, established in the early 1970s by a group of environmentalists and former students who believed in self-reliance. It was never formally incorporated, had no zip code, and was not recognized beyond a few county permits for land use. The community had reportedly dissolved by the late 1990s, but a few structures remained on private land deep in the woods north of Cazadero. Grace made the trip in late October. The route was rough, mostly gravel and broken pavement that wound through redwood groves and silent hills. She parked her car when the road narrowed and walked the rest. After an hour of hiking, she saw what was left of Stillwater. 2 cabins stood against the slope, both with broken chimneys and sunken roofs. Ivy had swallowed one wall entirely, but there was another structure farther up the ridge, partially hidden by tall brush and slanting shadows. It looked sturdier than the others, its door recently reinforced with metal latches. Smoke rose faintly from a stovepipe. Grace approached slowly, heart-pounding, with no real idea of what to expect. She knocked twice. No answer. She waited, then turned to leave, unsure if she had made a mistake coming alone. Before she could step away, the door opened. A woman stood there. Her hair was streaked with gray, cut unevenly. Her eyes were sharp but tired. She said nothing, only looked at Grace for a long time. Grace, holding the letter in her hand, said softly that she'd come to ask about Stillwater. The woman nodded once and stepped back to let her in. The cabin was sparse but clean. There was a small table with a notebook, a wood-burning stove, and a chair covered in stitched fabric that looked handmade. On the wall hung a framed drawing. A cabin with smoke curling from the chimney. 3 stick figures stood inside. Grace did not speak again until the woman sat across from her. She asked no questions. She did not offer a name. But when Grace opened the old workbook from Brookings and placed it on the table, the woman reached out and touched the page as if tracing something long lost. She stared at the name printed in block letters. Anna. She did not speak it. She only closed her eyes for a moment and then opened them again. Grace stayed for 2 hours. She said little, asked less. The woman spoke slowly, never directly addressing the past. She talked about the trees, about how they leaned in the winter. She mentioned the wind and the way it moved differently through dry brush than through pine. She described birds that did not sing anymore. She never said where she had been or what had happened. But before Grace left, she handed her a folded sheet of paper. It was another drawing. This one showed a trail winding from a cabin into the forest with small stones marking its edge. On the back, a line had been written. I remembered the path. I just wanted peace. Grace did not press for more. She knew this was the end. She returned to her car and drove away without looking back. The following spring, Grace published her findings in a quiet article for the Society's journal. She named no one. She mentioned no specific locations. She titled the piece, "The Girl Who Knew the Trees." The article spoke about endurance silence and the weight of fear that lasts longer than childhood. It ended with a single reflection. Not everyone who goes missing is lost. Some are searching for a place where no one follows them anymore. Anna Harper was never found in the traditional sense. She was never returned to the world she once knew, but she survived it. She walked through years of wilderness, evaded every net, escaped every assumption. She became her own world. In the quiet of Stillwater, she found what the world could not give her, not rescue, not justice, but peace. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe for more real-life inspired mysteries. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the plot and where you're watching from, so drop a comment below and join the conversation.